Just 3 short days after filming finished for Dracula, Terence Fisher was behind the camera and Peter Cushing back in front of the camera for shooting to begin on the follow-up to Curse of Frankenstein, The Revenge of Frankenstein. Hammer Studios were on a roll. Even more so than Curse of Frankenstein, the first film, The Revenge of Frankenstein exemplifies Hammer's approach to these classic characters. In short, completely throw out the rule book. Where the Universal movies followed the trials and tribulations of the creature, Hammer would follow the money, and Peter Cushing is the money baby. We're going to be following the adventures and misadventures of Baron Victor Frankenstein. And what better way to completely discombobulate the viewer and confound expectations by having, in the first sequel, Victor be completely successful. The Revenge of Frankenstein, in my personal opinion, is probably best watched in a double bill with its predecessor. It's got the tightest continuity of any of the Frankenstein sequels, picking up directly where the first movie left off. Although some of the details are shuffled around a little bit. In the first movie, the creature wasn't known about and Victor was sent to the guillotine for his crimes. By the time Revenge of Frankenstein rolls around, the notoriety of Frankenstein has spread across the country and probably even the continent. The film is shot through with dark humour, and it really helps leaven the bread, if you will, just releases the pressure valve. Peter Cushing is having an absolute blast here. My personal favourite moment of his is completely dialogue free, when he returns to the nominal site of his own grave to dig up the corpse that took his place, only to find his grave being grave robbed, and then at the site of Victor, the grave robber has a heart attack and drops down dead into Victor's own grave. The over-the-shoulder sort of look he gives his assistant is absolutely priceless. They've come here for one body and they've got an even fresher body drop dead right in front of them. Manna from heaven, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. There's another moment where his assistant in this film, his new assistant, Hans Cleve, is marvelling at his laboratory and says, "I've never seen anything like it." And Frankenstein says, "Really? No, I don't suppose you have." Cushing is on point. I'm going to say this a lot in subsequent reviews of subsequent Frankenstein movies, but you can take Cushing to the bank every day of the week. With each new Frankenstein tale from Hammer Studios, Cushing gives us a slightly different take on the character. Here the Baron seems gentler, seems a little kinder. In Curse of Frankenstein he was a real nasty piece of work. But here he seems to have dropped all of his libidinous urges. He's much more focused on his mission, seems to be very asexual here. There are even temptation put in his path that he simply has no time for here, which is at odds with the Victor who was using Elizabeth as a sort of prop wife for society, whilst at the same time having an affair and then eventually murdering Justine because she threatened to reveal that affair. Frankenstein here is very much down to business. He's set up a practice in a new town, built it up over 3 years, serving and charging the well-to-do in the city in order to fund alms work to attend to the poor. It's a weird sort of utopian vision of what Victor could achieve if he put his brilliant mind to doing good. Except it is all a front, and of course he's using the poor of the city to farm parts, body parts for his experiments. Yes, curing them of their ills, but also divesting them of the odd leg or arm that he thinks that he could put to better use than they themselves. I hope you'll indulge me here for a couple of minutes while I go off on a tangent, because it was whilst I was watching Revenge of Frankenstein that I started daydreaming a little. The Carlsbrook Medical Council convening to talk about how they should deal with Dr. Stein in their midst reminded me of Thomas Harris's Hannibal and Hannibal Lecter posing as Dr. Fell in the Florence Museum, and the museum board discussing what to do with him and whether or not they should appoint him the full-time curator, the caretaker role he's had with them. And then in the very next scene in Revenge of Frankenstein, where Hans Cleave confronts Dr. Stein in his quarters with his true identity, and they have this very pointed conversation where Cleave is blackmailing Frankenstein, but Frankenstein is holding his knife while he dissects his roast fowl dinner, and that, it just felt like, it just made me wonder what a 1950s, 1960s Hammer movie version of Silence of the Lambs would have looked like, with Cushing playing the outwardly appearing very charming, erudite, hugely intellectual gentleman who is a monster. Can you imagine him in the asylum scenes from Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed? Can you imagine those mid-Victorian asylum scenes that we get in the Hammer films, with all of the destitutes and down at heel, poor and sick and mentally unwell, and in the very last cell, the very last cage, a resplendently turned out Peter Cushing with a writing desk and a gramophone and pictures, and maybe Hazel Court sent to interview him to get his thoughts on how to capture a Jack the Ripper style killer, maybe played by Patrick Troughton or someone like that, who is loose in the foggy streets of London. I went off on a little flight of fancy and wished that maybe my editing skills were better than they are, and that I could have put together, using clips of Cushing from this Hammer period and other Hammer clips, a sort of trailer for a Hammer horror version of Silence of the Lambs. But anyway, let's get back to the actual film that actually exists. Cushing doesn't carry the weight alone. There are a couple of standout performances, two characters in one role. Carl, the character of Carl, first played by Oscar Quitac as Frankenstein's assistant, a twisted, sort of deformed body, hired by Frankenstein to save him from the guillotine at the start of the movie, with the promise that Frankenstein would use his skills to fix his body. And secondly, by Michael Gwynne, playing the same character, now as Carl's brain, inside the brand new and perfect body that Victor has created for him, which slowly starts to degenerate. There isn't even really a monster in this movie. Instead, we get the story of a man who seeks to have his afflictions cured by Frankenstein's radical scientific approach, and it works. Frankenstein's aim in the first film is to create the perfect human, and in this, rather than the mess he creates with the Christopher Lee creature, that poor creature, he creates a man that looks normal, as you and I, apart from some slight scarring around his head. He was right. He can do it. He can cure the most incurable physical ills. But through accident and misadventure, this new person or old person in a new body suffers head trauma and begins to lose his humanity. More, I think, was intended to have been made about Carl's degeneration into cannibalism, but the BBFC objected at script stage, so those elements were removed even from the script before filming started, although the film alludes to his descent into cannibalism. Really, the denouement for this character is the moment where he gate crashes, literally crashes through the patio windows at a Contessa's recital party. And instead of an orgy of violence that we would expect, or a burning castle, or destruction, we have the sight of one of Frankenstein's creations, desperate, on his knees in front of Victor, begging him for his help. The film is bookended with Frankenstein's escape routes. At the start of the film, the escape route he planned himself from the guillotine, which took just money and persuasion, and the priest took his place. His escape route at the end of the film, his plan B, is an absolute doozy. Whilst much of high society is willing to turn a blind eye to things that are slightly off about Frankenstein, when he confronts the council and asks them to provide proof, and they cannot, because he's a respected member of the community, many a blind eye will be turned. The lower classes that he has preyed upon and farmed limbs from care not a jot for any of that, and beat him to death. Frankenstein, however, has trained Hans Cleve in his art, and he has already built an escape body for himself, a secondary body. His brain is transplanted into the new body, and he and Hans transpose themselves to London, where he continues to build a new clinic and new experiments as Dr. Frank. It's too darkly delicious for words. The hammer glamour is there. The character of Margaret, played by Eunice Gayson, James Bond's girlfriend, no less, in the first two James Bond movies. So she's a real pip. She's easy on the eye. She's given a little more to do than Hazel Court as Elizabeth in the first movie. Maybe a little less to do than Valerie Gaunt as Janice, the maid slash lover slash victim of Victor in the first movie. She is little more really than a female wrinkle in the Doctor's perfectly laid out man plans, though. But I think we'll see that the roles for women will improve in some of the later sequels. But my opinions on this film are as discardable as a substandard head on a body that we could put to some decent scientific use. So I'll round off this video with another opinion taken from an Internet Movie Database user review. It's channel favourite Jacob John Taylor 1, JJT1 again, who has this to say about The Revenge of Frankenstein. This movie is a sequel to The Cure of Frankenstein. It is one of the best horror movies ever. It has a great storyline. It also has great acting. It is very intense. It has great special effects. If you like very scary movie, then you need to see this movie. This is a true horror classic. This is an old movie, but it does not feel old. I need more lines and I'm running out of things to say. Dr. Frankenstein creates another monster in this one. This movie is scarier than The Exorcist. What is scarier than this movie would be The Cure of Frankenstein. Still, this is a very scary movie. Very scary, very scary, very scary.